Chapter 6, Part 5. These reports in the London scandal sheets leapt with lightning speed across the channel, and the Paris press gobbled them up. Even a paper of as high a standard as the Figaro came out with an account of the alleged Bernhardt capers. The article by Albert Wolff, a staff writer, upbraided the wayward actress for behavior unworthy a member of the House of Molière. This was too much for the wayward actress. She dispatched a long and costly telegram to Wolff, categorically denying the reports. She defended her art exhibition, of which, for some reason, Wolff disapproved, by stating that as one of the most poorly paid members of the Française, she had a right to make up the difference. Her wire concluded, "As to the respect due the House of Molière, dear Monsieur Wolff, I lay claim to keeping that in mind more than anyone else. And now, if the stupidities invented about me have annoyed the Parisians, and if they have decided to receive me ungraciously on my return, I do not wish anyone to be guilty of such baseness on my account, so I will submit my resignation to the Comédie Française. I am sending you this letter by wire, as the consideration I have for public opinion gives me the right to commit such folly, and I beg you, dear Monsieur Wolff, to accord my letter the same honor you did the calumnies of my enemies." Wolff obediently afforded the letter that honor. The announcement came as a bombshell which resounded throughout Paris and rocked the corps at the Gaiety. A delegation called on their rebel member. It was headed by the grand old comedian Edmond Goat, the doyen or dean of the Française. Goat pontificated about sacred traditions and glorious hierarchy. Sophie Croizette took her friend to her bonny bosom and protested that the committee would never accept her resignation. Kathleen affectionately patted her hand and told her not to be a rash child, that once in the Française one was there for life. Kathleen himself was to leave the institution some 7 years later. Monet Sully put on in his plea in his usual voice, which Sacha Guitry said sounded as though he were addressing one at a distance of 50 yards and separated by a river. His affair with Sarah had ended by then, but they had remained good friends. He thundered on about probity and moral obligation. Monet came from a long line of Huguenot pastors, and Sarah wrote that his whole speech savored of Protestantism. The person who had most influence was a fine actor with the unfortunate name Worms, a warm and direct man who merely asked her where she thought she'd find herself better off, and when a telegram arrived from Perrin with assurances of devotion and admiration, she decided to postpone her decision. During her years at the Comédie, Sarah Bernhardt's health had never been consistently good. In London, it was no better. She still had genuine fainting spells, still occasionally bled at the mouth. Toward the finish of the Gaiety run, she was booked for 2 appearances on the same day, a matinee of Dumas's Filles l'Étranger, followed by an evening performance of Hernani. She had caught a severe cold, was in a state of utter depletion, with a racking cough and a high temperature. In her dressing room prior to the matinee, she went into such a violent chill she couldn't put on her makeup. Twice she fainted. The prospect of getting through the matinee seemed insurpassable, let alone Hernani that night. Of the 2, Doña Sol was a far more difficult but far more important role than that of Mrs. Clarkson, the heroine of L'Étranger. 15 minutes before curtain time, she sent word to the management that she'd not be able to go on for the matinee. There was, of course, a backstage crise, but she remained adamant, and a change of bill had hectically to be slapped together. When it was announced that due to sudden indisposition of Mademoiselle Bernhardt, the play for that afternoon would be Tartuffe, 3/4 of the audience got up and demanded their money back at the box office. That evening she managed with heroic effort to get through Hernani, and the house was a sellout. Next day, however, the papers were full of indignation over her cutting the afternoon performance. The Paris press was even more indignant. She was accused of putting on an act of deliberately shirking her duty. Sarcey wrote testily that the time comes when troublesome children must be put to bed. The outcry was unjustified. Whatever her offstage behavior in the theater, Sarah Bernhardt was a conscientious professional. Never during her long career did she cancel a performance unless it was physically impossible for her to go on, and often she played in a state of illness that would have defeated any other actress. This was a great and serious artist, dedicated to her work. London forgave her. The engagement ended in clouds of glory, and the company returned to France, the home journey being considerably enlivened by the added impedimenta of the Bernhardt livestock, of which the cheetah caused a near mutiny on the Channel boat. Paris welcomed back her beloved comediennes, although there was marked public antagonism toward the leading actress. The season was to open with the annual tribute to Molière, that ceremony in which, 17 years earlier, Sarah had distinguished herself by whacking Madame Natalia in the face. There was much speculation as to whether or not she would risk taking part in this year's function. She received anonymous letters warning her not to. Some were even written to the papers, one of which read, "My poor skeleton. You will do well not to show your horrible Jewish nose at the opening ceremony day after tomorrow. I fear it would serve as a target for all the potatoes that are now being cooked, especially for you in your kind city of Paris. Have a paragraph put in the papers to the effect that you have been spitting blood and remain in bed and think over the consequences of excessive publicity. A subscriber." Perrin summoned her to his office and suggested that it would be better part of valor for her not to take part in the ceremony, that she was certain to be met by hisses and catcalls from a hostile public. The prospect of facing a hostile public was as the smell of gunpowder to a warhorse for Mademoiselle Revolté. In a quiet, even voice, she announced, "I shall take part in the ceremony, monsieur," and swept out of his office. The performance was the traditional one, the bust of Molière on its pedestal placed stage center, the players coming on in pairs to bow and pay homage with a short scene from one of the master's works. Sarah chose to go on alone. Her reason, she said, was that she did not wish any escorting actor to have to share whatever demonstration might be in store for her. Her turn came, and she made her entrance. Sarah Bernhardt's entrances were usually electrifying spectacles in themselves, but now she walked on with simple dignity and head erect. The audience, which had greeted each of the other participants with a dutiful hand, watched her in stony silence. She came directly down to the footlights and faced her potential firing squad. She didn't bow. She hadn't paused to bow to Molière. She merely stood, stock still. Her expression was neither ingratiating nor defiant. It was one which merely implied, "Well, here I am. What are you going to do about it?" What the audience did was wait for a number of breathless seconds, then, of a sudden, break into spontaneous and thundering applause. There were even a few cries of, "Welcome home, our Sarah!" Paris had forgiven her prodigal enfant terrible, as Paris was to do time and again. During the ensuing months, Bernhardt continued to ponder an eventual break with the Française. She realized the prestige of being with France's leading national theater. The grand old house itself she regarded with admiration, actually with reverence. Even after she had left it, her veneration remained steadfast. On one evening, when she happened to be there as a spectator, standing in the foyer between acts, she spied a certain visiting European king who was still casually wearing his top hat. Leaving her party, she sailed across to the sovereign, bobbed him a perfunctory curtsy, and said, "Monseigneur, in this shrine of art one does not remove one's crown, but one removes one's hat." But at the present time she was tired of serving as a priestess in that shrine. What finally brought about her rift was when Perrin insisted upon casting her in the part of Dona Clorinda in Emile Augier's Les Aventurières. She loathed the part and loathed the play, which is indeed an insipid affair, all about moral honor and the triumph of virtue, without any good dramatic bite. Like much of the author's work, it is written in mediocre verse. As Tristan Bernard, the boulevardier of the 90s, was to say, "I have great admiration for Emile Augier. I doubt if it would last through a first reading." During rehearsals, Sarah, being ill, was absent several times. She studied her part half-heartedly and kept forgetting her words. One day, when Aguirre himself remonstrated with her, she snapped back, "What do you want me to do? I know I'm bad, but not as bad as your lines." She was too tired to bother with fittings for her costume, and the day before the premiere, she developed a racking sore throat and laryngitis. She went to Perrin and entreated him to postpone the opening for one more week. Perrin refused, declaring he was fed up with kowtowing to her whims. She went through with the performance, and it was the biggest flop of her career. She played with shocking carelessness, frequently going up in her lines. Her voice, due to the laryngitis, was a rasping foghorn, and her costume not only hideous, but miles too large. She said herself that she looked like an English teapot. The audience was disgusted, and her notices were deservedly bad. After reading every one, she sat down and wrote the following letter: Perrin. Monsieur l'Administrateur, you forced me to play when I was not ready. What I foresaw came to pass. The result of the performance exceeded my expectations. This is my first failure at the comedy, and it shall be my last. I warned you on the day of the dress rehearsal, and you ignored my warning. I keep my word. When you receive this letter, I shall have left Paris. Be so kind, Monsieur l'Administrateur, as to accept my immediate resignation, and believe me, yours faithfully. She made 2 copies of this letter and had each sent by hand to the editors of the Figaro and the Gaulois, respectively. The original, intended for Perrin, she casually dropped in the mailbox, then hurried out of the city to remain for a few days of anonymity in a hotel at Havre. Perrin had the shock of reading the newspaper announcements of his prize star's flight from home orbit before her letter of resignation reached him. No need to dwell on his reaction, nor on that of the governing body. They filed a breach of contract suit against her for the sum of 300,000 francs, which was later reduced to 100,000. As a sidelight on Bernhardt's sense of financial obligation, it might be mentioned that she never paid these damages. The suit was delayed in litigation for 20 years. Finally, in 1900, she settled by letting the Comédie Française, whose building had been nearly destroyed by their fire of March 8th, move into her theater for 10 months while she went on tour. At the time of her departure, she did have to forfeit 40,000 francs of her benefit money, which had automatically been deposited in trust at the Française. One of the rulings of that organization is to retain a portion of the salary of every sociétaire, the accumulated sum of which is returned at the time of departure, provided the member departs in the good graces of the administration and governing body. It may be imagined in what sort of graces Sarah Bernhardt departed. She must have realized the rashness of this step, but if the future was uncertain, she faced it boldly and with a sense of liberation. Sir George Arthur said that she was as well adapted to the official atmosphere of the Comédie Française as Whistler might have been to the standards of the Royal Academy. Paris, of course, denounced her as a renegade and deserter, but she didn't care. Years later, when Lisiane Bernhardt dared question her grandmother about the ethics of her action, Sarah answered with one of her characteristic speeches, which might have come right out of L'Aiglon. The Théâtre Français is and always will be the ensign of our country's dramatic art. It is true that I refuse to serve in its ranks. Am I therefore a deserter? No. My role was to unfurl that flag to the winds of other nations, to make it known beyond other frontiers. The future alone will judge whether or not I have accomplished my mission. The first winds to flutter that flag were the breezes of England. Hardly had news of her final break reached London than Hollingshead and Mayer made her a handsome offer for a return engagement at the Gaiety, she to head a company of her own in whatever repertory she chose. She accepted with alacrity and immediately assembled a first-rate cast which she herself directed in a repertory. With her infallible instinct for theater, she made sure her choice of plays would go with the public. 1 or 2 of the classics that offered her more spectacular roles, plus Scribe's Adrien Lecouvreur and the Melech Hellevay drawing-room comedy of the pathos Frou-Frou, less classic but better box office. It was her first plunge into the career she was to follow from now on, that of an actress-manager. London welcomed her back rapturously that season of 1880. Theirs was a happy frenzy that was to renew itself throughout the years on each of her recurrent visits. No wonder she adored the British capital. Her houses were sellouts, and the press unanimous in praise. A few Paris critics came over to inspect her acting, half hoping it would be inferior to that of her Francaise performances, but even they had to admit that in her new independence, Sarah was better than ever. Sarcey wrote in Le Temps, nothing at the Comédie Française will ever replace for us this last act of Adrienne Lecouvreur. And the Figaro's usually acid reviewer, Vitu, said that Sarah Bernhardt had risen to a height of dramatic power which could never be surpassed. When she returned to Paris, the dignitaries of the Française again called on her and implored her to return to the fold. All would be forgiven, they promised her, and the 100,000 franc fine would be cancelled. She merely smiled and showed them her London box office statements with grosses half again higher than those taken in by the House of Molière. She thanked and embraced them all, then skipped off to Brussels, where at the Theatre de la Monnaie, Monnaie, she played Adrienne Lecouvreur and Frou Frou to cheering audiences. Her next stop was a week at the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen. The King and Queen attended her opening night. With them in the box were the King and Queen of the Hellenes and the Princess of Wales. Of the latter, Bernhardt wrote that the princess's beauty blinded her to anyone else present. She and the future Queen Alexandra formed a real friendship that lasted for many years. At the finish of the play, the royal ladies tossed their bouquets onto the stage. The leading man gathered them up, and Sarah clutched them to her heart with fitting gestures of ecstasy, while the house gave her a standing ovation. The audience went equally wild over Frou Frou, and Sarah Bernhardt was the toast of Denmark. The king presented her with the Danish Order of Merit, which, adorned as it was with diamonds, Sarah found to be very pretty. The royal yacht was put at her disposal to take her and her company out to Elsinore for a visit to the castle and Hamlet's tomb. They returned at sundown. Preceding the yacht was a smaller craft manned by students who, as they sailed along, sang ancient Norse folk songs and scattered roses on the water. And all that was for me, she wrote in her memoirs. All those roses, all that love, all that musical poetry. Then she winds up modestly, and the setting sun, it was also for me. I felt very near to God. There was one jarring incident which might have ruined the success of her Copenhagen stay. At a supper in her honor after the final performance, the German ambassador, a Baron Magnus, rose, a glass in hand, proposed a toast. To the country that has given us such great art, to France. Sarah, who was a fanatic patriot and like many of the French remembered 1870 and still smarted under the loss of Alsace and Lorraine, sprang to her feet, raised her glass, and cried in ringing tones, "Yes, to France, Mr. Prussian ambassador, but to France in her entirety." And at that, the orchestra spontaneously struck up the Marseillaise. The gesture, colorful as it was, caused a diplomatic crisis. Baron Magnus was a delightful and popular man, and for him to be openly snubbed at a public function was considered a slur on Danish hospitality. The next morning, at an early hour, the French ambassador called on his imprudent countrywoman and persuaded her to write a note of apology to the Baron, which she did in her most disarming manner, and the incident was closed. After these triumphs, she returned to Paris. Her old friend and former Odeon manager, Decanel, came to her with the suggestion that since the French public had not yet seen her superb new performances, Frou Frou and Adrienne Lecouvreur, he booked her for a brief whirlwind tour of the larger provincial towns of France. He was cautious enough not to risk any Paris appearances. It was a joint venture and a profitable one. Sarah was elated and invigorated. The road, that adventure-filled highway whose joys so few of today's actors have dared to explore, was opening out before her, leading to further horizons. For the immediate future, that road led westward across the Atlantic, and she had already settled her plans to follow it.